Hey out there, everybody. It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks. We are looking at Izzet this time in our limited set review of Guilds of Ravnica. So all of the blue, red, gold cards, as well as all of the Jumpstart cards in the set. Speaking of which, Jumpstart is the mechanic for Izzet, and we'll just go ahead off the bat and say that it's probably the most inherently weak mechanic of all of them, since the cards that have Jumpstart on them are not pushed in power level. There are very few Jumpstart cards that are just inherently powerful. You're just going to see basic normal effects that you would expect on cantrips and just your average spells, your instants and sorceries, but they'll have Jumpstart added to them. In case you don't know what Jumpstart is, it's a variant on Flashback or even Retrace. It's closer to Retrace than Flashback. It allows you to recast an instant or sorcery from the graveyard by discarding a card. So if you look at the example below, Chemister's Insight can be cast the first time just as a normal card, and then while it's sitting in the graveyard, you can jumpstart it by discarding a card in addition to its regular costs, and then you get to exile the card out of your graveyard. So you only get to jumpstart it once, whereas Retrace, you could retrace over and over again for each land you wanted to discard. You still have to pay the actual mana cost when you jumpstart it from your graveyard. But this promotes a little bit of self-milling and double spelling or multi-spelling. So we're going to see a few cards in this mechanics video or in this Izzet video that promote or rather really want you to cast multiple spells within the same turn, or just do a lot of spell casting in general, which is Izzet's whole thing, right? Izzet is the instant sorcery guild of Ravnica. So Jumpstart fits the guild, but again, none of it's pushed, and it might be, in my opinion, the least exciting mechanic, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, right? Let's go and start off with the sideboard cards. These are, again, cards that either require you to build a whole deck around them, or cards that are only good in certain situations if your deck supports them, or just cards that are fully unplayable, like our first one, Thousand Year Storm, aptly named. It's 4 blue-red, 6 mana total for a mythic rare enchantment, and it has a lot of text about instants or sorceries. It says, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, copy it for each other instant and sorcery spell you've cast before this turn. You may choose new targets for the copy. So it allows you to, storm off in a sense, right? The problem, of course, being that if you play this, it doesn't necessarily work the turn you play it. If you play this and you somehow also cast an instant or sorcery during the same turn, it still really didn't do anything, since you need to get to the second instant or sorcery within a given turn before this actually does something. And by the time you get to 6, 7 mana, and you're putting this enchantment on board, you're probably running out of spells. Now, of course, you have Jumpstart, so you might have filled your graveyard up with a bunch of Jumpstart spells, but a lot of the ones that we're going to see are not really worth going through the trouble of copying multiple times. This is the type of card that once a format wears down a little bit and everybody's done everything there is to do in the format, then I'd be happy to take it and just try goofing around with it, but I don't think it's a particularly good build around. But hey, I've been proven wrong. The power level is there. If you can get a couple really cheap burn spells or ways to drain life or something like that, and then stick this on the board, maybe you can chain them together for a win, but I'll have to see it before I go trying it. Next up, probably Izzet's worst card in my opinion, is Firemind's Research. This is blue and a red for a rare enchantment, and it says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a charge counter on Firemind's Research. Okay. For 1 in a blue mana, you can remove 2 charge counters to draw a card, or for 1 in a red mana, you can remove 5 charge counters to deal 5 damage to any target. Now, this card seems really terrible to me. You obviously get the design, right? Izzet wants to cast a lot of instants or sorceries. You play this, you start casting those spells, you build up charge counters, and you use the effects. But 5 charge counters is a lot, and even 2 charge counters to draw a card is something. Because if you consider the case where you play this, maybe you get it on turn 2, which is nice, and then you follow up, you cast 2 instants or sorceries, then you remove 2 charge counters to draw a card. Well, all you've done in that case is you've cantripped Firemind's Research into another card. Playing an enchantment, doing a lot of work, and then drawing a single card off that enchantment, if that's all that card ever does, it's pretty bad. You would need to cast another 2 instants or sorceries, pay another 2 mana, to draw an additional card, in which case this has been 6 mana after 4 spells to simply go up a card. I guess if your deck is entirely 1 or 2 mana spells, then you might be able to get something off it. But what are you doing with that last ability, that second ability to deal 5 damage? Remove 5 charge counters? That's 5 instants or sorceries you have to cast before this gets 5 charge counters, and that means you can't have used the ability to draw a card a single time. 5 charge counters, 5 instants or sorceries to deal 5 damage to a single target. You don't get to split it up. That does not seem worth it to me at all. It's not even like you can just draft an all spells deck and use this as your win con, since you'd have to cast, what, 20 instants or sorceries before you could actually kill somebody with the last ability. And the problem is you're going to be super tempted to use the first ability to draw cards, which means you're never getting to the second ability, which means that you're not really dealing damage, and this doesn't seem like it does anything. We'll see it the rest of this video. There are perfectly fine draw spells in Izzet, so I don't know why we need this janky enchantment-based draw spell, and this isn't even a really efficient damage dealer with the last ability since it takes so much work. If this didn't require mana to activate the 2 abilities, it would be a little bit better, but even then I don't think I would play it. Alright, this is actually the lowest we've seen a split card in my reviews, but I'm not too excited about Invert or Invent, either or to be honest. Invert is a single blue-red hybrid mana, so it's 1 mana for an instant, and it says switch the power and toughness of each of up to 2 target creatures. Now, just a reference, if you're playing at a pre-release or one of the few events going on early on for Ravnica, just know that Invert has been errated. The card, the way it reads on the card, it would suggest that this is a permanent change for the remainder of the game, but it has been errated so that it only lasts until end of turn. So just keep that in mind. This is not a permanent effect. It only lasts 1 time. And that's just the type of effect that I do consider a sideboard effect. You could put it in your main board. It's going to be great against the janky defender creatures that are in this deck, and sometimes you can use it, just get a bunch of damage in. We'll see a couple creatures later on that have high toughness and low power that this could be decent for, but it's definitely a build around. You would either need those cards first, or you would need to use this against your opponent's creatures to kind of kill off their walls or make their creatures way smaller in combat or something like that. The other half is Invent, which is 4 blue-red for an instant, and it says search your library for an instant card and or a sorcery card, reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle your library. My problem is that this is 6 mana. Paying 6 mana, casting a spell, and then using your entire turn just to go fetch up 2 more spells does not seem really worth it to me. I would want Invent in a deck that cares a lot about casting instants or sorcery, so if I have some of the payoffs later in this video, I could definitely consider Invent here, which means that I'm kind of ignoring Invert altogether unless it comes up in a situation. But I don't think 6 mana tutors, even if they net you 2 cards, are going to be worth your time or worth your energy to put in, unless you have some really powerful instants or sorceries. If all you're doing is using this to go get a draw spell and maybe a burn spell or a removal spell, then why not just put an additional draw spell in your deck in the first place to help find those cards rather than using an entire turn to guarantee that you get those cards? Thankfully, that's all we have for our unplayables, or rather our build-arounds. I'm sure those cards are all playable in some degree, but we're going to move on to our filler, our low-pick playables, the cards that we're hoping to get after the wheel, and even when we do wheel, we're not super excited about them. Starting with, we'll actually talk about these 2 cards together, Maximize Velocity and Maximize Altitude. They have the same design to them, so it's a mirrored pair. Maximize Velocity is a single red for sorcery, and it's a common, and it gives +1/+1 in trample, or rather, +1/+1 in haste to a target creature until end of turn, and it has jumpstart. Maximize Altitude is a single blue to do the same thing, except it gives flying in +1/+1 until end of turn. They both have jumpstart, they're both 1 mana, they're both common sorceries, you get the idea, right? You power up a creature, and then you give them some extra ability on top of that. Neither of these effects are super strong. Maximize Altitude, I think, is the much better ability, since with Jumpstart, you could conceivably cast this and then Jumpstart it during the same turn for just 2 mana. Give some creatures fly-in, cast 2 spells, trigger the abilities that care about casting spells, and maybe just destroy your opponent out of nowhere. Although you do need those payoffs to make this card good. Just using it on your average deck to get in maybe 3 extra damage, not really what I'm super excited about. Maximize Velocity, I think, is a significant amount worse than Altitude, because sometimes given haste doesn't allow you to still attack with a creature if your opponent has a big blocker, whereas flying more often will allow you to attack with a creature that you didn't. So of the two, I think Altitude is better. Worth noting that I think Maximize Velocity is a fine card in Boros decks. They can definitely benefit from an extra power toughness boost and haste, and the Jumpstart gives you a second crack at it later in the game. So it's good to haste up a Mentor and get in a lot of damage your opponent might not have been expecting, but once it is in the graveyard, your opponent will play around it a little bit more. Maximize Altitude is probably only going to be good in Izzet, probably not too great in Dimir, but if you have payoffs that care about you casting spells, you could do worse than either of these two. Radical Idea is 1 in a blue for an instant. It's a common, and it says draw a card, it has Jumpstart. So if this was 1 cheaper, or maybe it drew 2 cards, or it did something, then I would like it a little bit more. If you think about what you get out of this card by the time you've cast it a single time and Jumpstarted it, you've paid 4 mana, you've drawn 2 cards, but you've used this and you've discarded another card. So all you've done is cycle 2 cards into 2 more cards. The first time you cast this, all you're doing is drawing a card at the expense of a card. So if you care about casting spells, then sure, that's something, but 2 mana cycle, and that's all the card does. Literally, a card that would just say 2 cycling on it is a card you would play some amount of the time, and it gives you some extra benefits, but it's not exciting, right? This is like a really expensive 2-turn Faithless Ludin of sorts. It turns 2 cards into 2 other cards, or like a Tormented Voice that you can split up across 2 turns, but for twice as much mana. I'm not really in love with it. I have the sneaking suspicion that people are going to think this card does more than it actually does, because they see draw a card on it, and they know Jumpstart lets it come back a second time. So they're going to see it as draw 2 for 2 mana or something like that, and that's just not what this card is. It's pretty weak, especially compared to one of the other draw spells we'll see here in a minute, but I think it's a fine card. Again, just like Maximize Velocity and Altitude, if your deck cares about casting spells, this might be something that you're interested in. Gravitic Punch is a card that unfortunately suffers from not having a certain word printed on it, but it's 3 in a red. It's a common sorcery, and it says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target player. That word being creature, of course, although I guess it does have the word creature on it, but you know what I mean. It can't let one of your creatures punch another creature's, which would have seemed completely fair for 4 mana at sorcery speed, but nonetheless, what you get is a burn spell here. Now, if you have some of those creatures that get bigger when you cast spells, or maybe you're playing, I don't know, red-green for some reason, or red-white, and you just happen to have high-power creatures, then this could add up to a lot of damage over the course of 2 turns. If you just use this on, say, I don't know, a 4-power creature, then over 2 turns you're going to deal 8 damage to your opponent, and if that's what your deck needs to finish out a game, then you could do worse than Gravitic Punch. But just remember that Jumpstart's always going to cost you an extra card. Worth noting at this point, too, that if you're playing Jumpstart, then it benefits you to hold on to some of your extra lands. If your deck curves out at 5 and you've already reached 5, maybe 6 mana on board, you don't really have too much of a use for those extra lands, so keep them in your hand and make sure you hold them to your Jumpstart spells. Although I'm not necessarily promoting the idea of playing Gravitic Punch in the first place, it could be a closer for some of the really fast decks that have trouble getting through creatures in the late game. Goblin Electromancer is back for the 14th billionth time, and it's still pretty mediocre. I get it, right? It cares about casting spells, making your spells cheaper is kind of a good thing, especially when you have Jumpstart. Just imagine Radical Idea costing a single blue and then another single blue to Jumpstart. That's way better and makes the card something exciting to play, but Electromancer is still just a 2-mana 2/2 and sometimes doesn't really have a profound effect on the game. It doesn't really get better as the game goes on either. It's a nice card to play on turn 2 and then maybe have some counter spells up or something like that and just be able to double spell a little bit more easily, but I don't think it's a card you need to prioritize. Plus, it's a card that other decks don't care about at all, so if you correctly identified that Izzet is open and nobody else is really taking Izzet cards, you can usually wheel the Electromancer. Follow that up with Sonic Assault, another Jumpstart card I'm not super excited about, but it has some play to it. It's 1 blue-red for an instant. It's a common, and it says tap target creature, deals 2 damage to that creature's controller. Well, it doesn't damage creatures, it just taps the creature down, and over the course of the 2 times you cast the spell, it's going to deal 4 damage total, tap 2 creatures. I feel like this is going to be more oriented towards a tempo burnout style deck than it is a control deck, and it's a good time to say that I think that's how you should be playing Izzet. You should be trying to beat down with Izzet, using your instants or sorceries to deal extra damage, and tempo your opponent out, bounce them back to your hand, get them through them in combat and stuff like that. You'll see cards like Gravitic Punch, Sonic Assault. A lot of them don't actually even hit creatures, they just hit the player. Sonic Assault by itself, not fantastic. It doesn't even stop the creature from untapping the next turn, so it's really a one-shot that just shocks your opponent. And Jumpstart, I'm really not excited to discard a card in order to cast this again, but hey, if you're getting beat down or you just need to get a few extra points of damage in, then Sonic Assault will do the trick. Otherwise, I think you can do better, and you should probably prioritize actual removal over something like this. The medium power level cards are up next. These are the cards that I am actually excited to put in my deck, but I don't take them particularly highly. The first one is Beam Splitter Mage. This has a lot of interesting capabilities to it. It's single blue, single red, so same as Goblin Electromancer, also a 2/2, and this one is an uncommon Vidalcan Wizard. It says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets only this card, if you control one or more other creatures that the spell could target, you can choose one of the creatures and copy that spell. The copy targets the chosen creature. So if I use a single target spell and I target Beam Splitter Mage, I get to then copy that onto another creature. So if I maximize Velocity Beam Splitter Mage, I get to freely maximize Velocity another creature. Note, because a lot of people might think about this off the top of their heads, this does not work with Gravitic Punch, since Gravitic Punch has a second target, being the opponent that you choose to deal damage to. So it doesn't work with fight spells like that. It doesn't bounce burn spells unless you're willing to kill your Beam Splitter Mage and one of your own creatures or something like that. So don't try to be too fancy with it. Just understand that it's supposed to work with pump spells. If you Sure Strike Beam Splitter Mage, you get to freely Sure Strike another creature. So it opens up some potential for mid-combat shenanigans too if you have really good combat tricks or something along those lines. It's going to work with one of the cards we see here in a minute quite nicely. Not this one, but the next card on the list is Chemist's Insight. This was the example I used for Jumpstart, and I think it's a solid card. 3 and a blue, uncommon, instant, draw 2 cards. See this quite often in sets. Normally there's a upside tacked onto it, and Jumpstart is an upside tacked onto it, and sometimes it just has no upside at all. It's just 4 mana, draw 2 cards, and even then you'll play that card some amount of the time. It does cost a lot of mana overall by the time you've cast this and you've jump-started it, so it is a little bit better for a controlling deck than it is one of these blitz out, kill your opponent, get them dead type decks that I'm talking about for Izzet. So it might actually be that this card is better for Dimir, especially when you consider Surveil and how Surveil works with Jumpstart, where you can ditch cards to your graveyard with Surveil and then jumpstart them from the graveyard just for extra value. I think there's a lot going on there with Dimir, but as far as just a generic blue card, this card does the trick quite nicely. If your deck cares about casting spells, I know I'm sounding like a broken record, then this is a card that you prioritize highly, and I think you'll pick it pretty highly anyway. Alright, the card that works with Beam Splitter Mage quite nicely is Quasi-Duplicate. This is 1 blue for a rare sorcery, and you create a token that's a copy of target creature you control. Also has Jumpstart. Now, I really like this card. I don't think it's quite bomb territory because we just got out of a format where we were playing Mirage Image, or what is it, Mirror Image? That's the little 3 mana copy one of your own creatures guy, the 0/0 that can come down and be a duplicate of one of your own creatures. And I noticed when playing that card, even though it was single blue, which is easier to cast than Quasi-Duplicate, that there are times you just can't put that card on board, or your creatures aren't good enough that you actually want to copy them. So I don't know. Quasi-Duplicate has me a little bit skeptical. Using Quasi-Duplicate on Beam Splitter Mage seems like the dream. You just get another Beam Splitter Mage and another copy of whatever you bounce it onto with the Mage's ability. So keep in mind that little interaction. And also, Quasi-Duplicate is probably just a fine card to put in your deck in the first place, since Mirage or Mirror Image, you're almost always playing it anyway. Note that it does target one of your creatures, which is different from how Mirror Image works. So if you target something and your opponent kills it in response, you will not get the token copy of it. Quasi-duplicate will fizzle. We have Beacon Bolt next. It's 1 blue and a red for a uncommon sorcery. It deals damage to target creature equal to the total number of instant and sorcery cards you own in exile and in your graveyard, and it has Jumpstart. So you get the design of this card. It deals damage equal to all the spells you've cast, including the ones that have been exiled from Jumpstart. So it's a way to include those and not discourage you from jumpstarting your own spells. I think this does suffer a little bit from having that sometimes can't be cast type situation where maybe you want to kill your opponent's 3-drop, but you haven't actually put instants or sorceries in the graveyard yet, and Bacon Bolt just sits and rots in your hand, gets a little bit crispy, and you got to wait until you cast other spells. But Bacon Bolt is going to be pretty good throughout the majority of the game, and it has a Jumpstart, so at some point it's going to kill a second creature. This type of removal spell only gets better as the game goes on, but keep in mind it only hits creatures. This one does not hit players, so you can't like double Bacon Bolt your opponent out of the game. I think it's probably going to play at a high power level, but I put it in the medium power level pack because you do have to prioritize a lot of spells when you're playing a card like this. Follow up, we have Risk Factor. This is another card that could probably go in one category higher. I'm not willing to call it a bomb by any stretch because it's one of those cards that gives your opponent options, and that's never really a good position to be in, but let's go and read it. Risk Factor is 2 and a red. It's a rare instant being kind of cool here, and it says target opponent may have Risk Factor deal 4 damage to them. If they don't, you draw 3 cards, and it has Jumpstart. So the initial time you cast this, your opponent's left with a dilemma. Do I take 4 damage, or do I let you draw 3 cards? In most situations, the right answer to that is, oh, just take the 4 damage. So 3 mana, deal 4 to an opponent is something that just not super interesting unless you're just a complete all-in aggro deck. And normally if my opponent casts a spell like that, like Browbeat against me, then I'm fine taking the damage, right? As long as I have any sort of semblance of a board presence and I'm not just going to die that turn, I'll take the damage rather than let my opponent have 3 cards. If your opponent does give you 3 cards for this, then that's great, right? Now where this gets interesting is that it has Jumpstart, so it's going to come back for a second round. It is going to cost you 2 cards. It's going to cost you the initial Risk Factor, and it's going to cost you the card that you discard for Jumpstart. And if your opponent just takes it both times, well, they took 8 damage from 2 cards. That's still not super exciting, right? If I go 3 mana, deal 4 to you, and then next turn I use a card and I go 3 mana, deal 4 to you, that's a game plan, right? You're at 12 all of a sudden, but you're down 2 cards. You've used 6 mana to do that, and I'm building up my board, which is why I think Risk Factor has some potential. This is the type of card that's really good against new players, and I hate to say that, but a lot of times they'll just be like, yeah, I don't want to take damage, go ahead and draw 3 cards, and I'm super happy about it. But it's a risky card. It's got an appropriate name, right? It's the type of thing that gives your opponent options, and whenever you give your opponent options, they're always going to choose whatever's more convenient for them. If they're playing a white deck, they have a ton of lifelinkers, then they don't care about the damage, right? They're just going to get it back. Or if they don't care about you having extra cards, they've got an insane control deck or something like that, then they might just let you draw cards, right? If they've got a huge board presence, you don't have a way to deal with it, then so what if you have 3 extra cards? I think it's a cool card. I don't think I'm first picking it until I lose to it, but I imagine it's the type of card too I will lose to a couple times, and then be just fine when people cast it some other times. Piston Fist Cyclops is 1 and a double blue-red hybrid mana. This is a 4/3 defender. It's a common Cyclops creature, and it says as long as you've cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn, it can attack as though it didn't have defender. So here's another card that could cross over into Boros quite nicely, just because the power and toughness is something that Boros would be interested in. It's just a huge beater, but it does require that you have a bunch of instants or sorceries. This is the type of card you want as many as you can get when you are down that aggro beatdown plan. When you're playing your maximize velocities and maximize altitudes and so on and so forth, the Piston Fist, that's hard to say, Piston Fist Cyclops is a card that you'll virtually play as many copies as you can get, right? And it's the type of card that you snap up quickly. Now, it's not something that Dimir cares about very much, but Izzet and Boros are probably going to fight over this. It's definitely at its best in Izzet because you get Jumpstart to trigger the ability multiple times, whereas in a Boros deck, you're probably going to have to cast some combat tricks pre-attacks in order to get this attack in, but the payoff is there. I think it's fine. It's also just a good defensive card if you're trying to set up or you're trying to maintain a board presence. It has 3 toughness, so it's not exactly easy to attack into, and 4 power for 3 mana is something that trades off quite nicely. So I like the card. I think it is something that you'll pick up multiple copies of, and you'll be pretty happy playing it. Hypothesis My Dizzle Dizzle is 3 blue-red for a common instant. It lets you draw 2 cards. You may then discard a non-land card. When you do, it deals 4 damage to target creature. Note that the templating is a little bit odd here. You do not have to target a creature in order to cast this spell. It's just after you've drawn 2 cards, you have the option to then target a creature. So it's not like there has to be a creature on board for you to target in order to cast the spell in the first place. Just a weird templating thing. But at any rate, what this does is base level, 5 mana, draw 2 cards at instant speed. That's a little bit on the weak side, hence this card being a common, but it gives you a little bit extra upside. On top of that, you may then pitch a card from your hand to deal 4 damage to a creature. So this is a little bit of card filtering plus damage or removal all in one. Note that if you use the second ability, then you're not really netting cards, right? You cast Hypothesis and you're discarding a card from your hand. That means you're down 2 cards, but you're up 2 cards, and you kill a creature. So I guess that is in, like, what, a 3 for 2 or something like that if you kill a creature with it, which is fine. 5 mana, being able to filter 2 cards into 2 other cards, and then also take a creature out seems fine to me, especially with this being an instant. I imagine this could have been an uncommon, and I wouldn't have batted an eyelash at it. The one problem here, of course, is that you can't discard a land to the ability, which means cards like this, normally you'll sandbag lands in the late game, and then you'll discard them to your card filter and effects. You can't do that here. You have to discard an actual card, and sometimes you might only have lands, which means you can't kill a creature anyway. I prepared for this one for the pre-release, by the way. This is the most memeable card I've ever seen in my life, so hope you guys hypothesis some people during your pre-releases. Enough about that. Let's move on to Direct Current. I waffled around a little bit about where I wanted this. I originally had it in my high power level picks, and then I bumped it down after a little bit of thinking about it. But the card is 1 red, 3 mana total for a common sorcery. It deals 2 damage to any target, and it has Jumpstart. So the mana cost is a little bit odd, which means you're not splashing this as removal. And also, we just got out of multiple formats where we had Shock. 1 mana, do what this does without Jumpstart, right? Obviously, Jumpstart here is adding a little bit to the mana cost, but remember, Jumpstart makes you discard a card, so you're using 2 cards and 6 mana to deal 2 damage to 2 targets. It's obviously fine, right? Even if you never Jumpstart it, if this kills your opponent's 3-drop or even a 2-drop in like a bad case scenario, then that's fine. It's removal. It'll do the trick. And sometimes it's better than that. It reminds me of Stagger Shock, which was 2 in a red, deal 2 damage to a creature, and then copy Stagger Shock the next turn, essentially. So you are getting some sort of deal out of this card, but you're not netting card advantage off of it, even if you kill 2 creatures. You have to have something you want to discard. I guess at the very least, this can go to your opponent's face, which means it can be 4 damage. It can finish the opponent off. Something to note, by the way, when you're playing against Izzet, is that a lot of their cards do deal direct damage, so you got to kind of play around that. You can't be super risky with your life total against an Izzet deck, I imagine. I think this card is fine. I think middle of the pack is where you want to pick it up. It's definitely not top tier removal, or at least it doesn't strike me as top tier removal. And there are some decks where it's just going to be bad. This doesn't even seem that good against Dimir, which has a lot of 3+ toughness creatures. So I don't know. I'm not excited about this removal spell the way I am some of the others. All right, speaking of which, we're at our high power level picks. These are the ones I'm looking to pick up really early in the pack because I know they will not wheel. I won't get a second crack at them, and if I'm not opening the bombiest bombs in the set, these are the cards that I'm happy picking up for Izzet. The first one being Crackling Drake, which in all honesty might just be a straight up bomb. Depends on how the format will play out. It's blue, red, so it is the hard to cast outside of Izzet part of this cycle. It has star 4 for its power and toughness. It's an uncommon Drake, and it has flying. It says its power is equal to the total number of instant and sorcery cards you own in exile. and in your graveyard. So it is Enigma Drake for 1 extra mana, but it also counts your exiled instants or sorceries. And then it has this extra text tacked on, which puts it near bomb territory. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card? What? This card seems absurdly strong to me in an Izzet deck, especially since it doesn't punish you for jumpstarting your spells. They still count toward its power. But at the very least, even if this dies, or if it doesn't have huge power, or it takes a while to start doing its thing, it draws you a card, which is a lot for a creature that's already going to be a win condition in your deck. Crackling Drake just seems really strong to me, and it's a huge payoff for being Izzet, right? It's the type of card you open in pack 3, and you're like, man, I really wish I was Izzet so I could take this Crackling Drake, but I don't know. The card seems really strong to me. It pays you off for actually having a bunch of instants or sorceries in your deck. And if you can play a control game or maybe a hyper aggressive game, Crackling Drake seems like it fits fine into either of those strategies. Ionize, cool name. It's 1 in blue and a red, 3 mana for a rare instant. It's a counterspell and it deals 2 damage to this spell's controller. So we have another 3 mana counterspell here. If you recall in the Demir video, if you watched it, there was a card called, I want to say the name is Sinister Sabotage. 1 blue, instant counter a spell and surveil 1. Hope I'm getting that right. But at any rate, what I said about that card was that I thought 3 mana counter spells were in a pretty good spot in the format against nearly everything except Boros, since Boros is often going to be able to stick some early game threats and start jamming with them. So if your answer to everything is a 3 mana counterspell, Boros might be able to get underneath you and beat you at your own game, but for most matchups, I think a 3 mana counterspell is going to be fine. And Ionize even gives you a tacked on extra shock to the opponent's face, which is very nice when you're playing a game plan that both cares about casting instants in the first place and also cares about dealing damage to the opponent directly. So again, we've already seen 4 or 5 cards that just deal damage to the opponent directly, a lot of which is just tacked on as an additional clause to an effect that you would already consider playing. League Guild Mage in a league of her own is a blue-red mana for a 2/2. So 2 mana 2/2 human wizard. It's uncommon like all of the other guild mages. And it has 3 blue, tap, draw a card. Just drop the mic right there. That's a fine ability. Even if it didn't have a second ability, you would be happy playing that already. And it's not even like you have to do this at sorcery speed or anything. Sure, we've seen guild mages in the past. We've seen cards that just have this ability without having to tap it down. But so what? This isn't that card, right? Obviously, it has flexibility. It has a second ability. So the first ability has a downside, quote unquote, of having a tap, which can be a downside sometimes. It's not like you can just jam this ability starting on turn 4 every single turn of the game, right? You got to be strategic about when you use it, when you're holding up mana for other things, so on and so forth. But I think that alone makes this a pretty high power level card. And then you get the second ability, not sure how often it'll come up, but it'll come up some amount of the time. It's X in red, also tap it. Copy target instant or sorcery spell you control with converted mana cost X. You may choose new targets for the copy. So if you have cheap instants or sorceries, maybe even cheap draw spells or something like that to put in your deck, then the League Guild Mage can copy them. And once you get to the late game, you might be able to copy some of your more expensive spells. I think the main power of the card is in the first ability, but the second ability is a nice thing to have tacked on. And again, this pays you off and rewards you for having a bunch of instants and sorceries in your deck. And when you're not casting instant sorceries, you just filter your mana into drawing a card. It's a great mana sink, just like a lot of the other cards that we've seen in other guilds so far, and just like all of the guild mages, it's a pretty high priority pick for a lot of decks. Expansion or Explosion is a card that I actually am not 100% sure about. I haven't played a lot with cards like Expansion, so we'll consider it. It is the rare split card for Izzet. The first half expansion is double blue-red hybrid mana, 2 mana for a instant. It says copy target instant or sorcery spell with converted mana cost 4 or less. You may choose new targets for the copy. Now, mana cost 4 or less seems like, oh, it's got a little bit of a restriction on it, but when you look back at this video and some of the videos we'll have to kind of wrap things up, there aren't really that many spells that are worth casting that cost more than 4 in the first place, and being able to hold up an extra 2 on top of more expensive spells is kind of like not a thing that's going to happen too often, right? So that restriction might as well not even be a restriction, since you're often going to use this on cheap spells anyway, and you're looking to use this on either potent draw spells like Chemister's Insight or cheap removal spells. Note that this one does not have to target a spell you control like the Guild Mage does. You can use it on your opponent's spell. So if your opponent's going to counter war you or your opponent has cheap removal, you can use Expansion in response. It's the type of card that you hold on to for a long time. Sometimes a good target never comes up, and as soon as your opponent gives you a decent target, or as soon as you draw something you can copy with it, it's a good time to go ahead and use Expansion because you might not get another crack at it. But thankfully, that's what Explosion is for. If Expansion never gives you a good opportunity to copy something, you can hold out until you get a decent amount of mana for Explosion, which is X, blue, blue, red, red for an instant, and it deals X damage to any target, and then target player draws X cards. You do not have to make the opponent draw cards if you are dealing damage to them. It doesn't work like that. You get to split it up. This is obviously a super exorbitantly high mana cost, right? Just 4 mana off the bat and then X. But I think it's pretty good. I think once you get to values of 3 or more for Explosion, it starts to look like a really appealing card. I would pay 7 mana to draw 3 cards and deal 3 damage to something. And if you imagine ever getting higher than that, then you're clearly just doing it, right? Doing 2 damage with Explosion doesn't seem super exciting, like shocking a creature once you get to turn 6 and drawing 2 cards. Well, that's something that my other spells can already do, right? I want the super high amounts for Explosion. So you've got a lot of flexibility, just like a lot of the other rares we've seen for these split cards, and 2 very divergent abilities. I like how these 2 play together, where Expansion is the type of card that promotes you waiting for something good, but if something good never comes up, this type of card normally ends up being a dead card, whereas Explosion saves it from being a dead card and actually turns it into something that will still net you cards and deal with something on the board. So I like the interplay between these 2 cards more than I do a lot of the other cards, but Explosion is expensive and Expansion is situational, so you can't quite classify it as a bomb, but hey, I've been wrong before, maybe it's a bomb. We Dragonauts. Okay, maybe overvaluating this card a little bit. On second thought, We Dragonauts not quite as powerful as some of the other cards in this same section, but it's just like Sky Knight Legionnaire to me. I've got a little bit of a nostalgia lens on it, where I'm imagining how good it was in other formats and just kind of hoping that it's just as powerful in this format. The card is 1 blue red for a 1/3 uncommon fairy wizard. It has flying, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. This is one of those beatdown cards for Izzet. It doesn't look like it, and if you're a newer player, you haven't played with a card like this before, then it might be a little bit unassuming because the body is not really what you would expect out of a gold 3-mana card, right? Even with flying, a 1/3 is not super exciting. And you think to yourself, oh, okay, if I'm casting an instant or sorcery every turn, then it attacks as a 3/3. Well, let me tell you that from my experience with playing with this card and, Mercurial Geists and cards that are very similar, it usually deals way more damage than just 3 per turn, especially when you consider cards like Maximize Velocity and Altitude and being able to just double spell some of your cheap jumpstart cards in the same turn. We Dragonauts can get out of hand pretty quickly. And we get to our bombs. 2 cards to talk about here, one of which is mythic, one of which is not. First one being Ral, Izzet Viceroy. This card has no business being anywhere else but everybody's top picks or bomb category. It is 3 blue-red for a 5 loyalty mythic rare legendary planeswalker. It's a Ral. And it says +1, look at the top 2 cards of your library. You put one in your hand and the other into your graveyard. So that's all upside. I just want to go on record for saying anytime a planeswalker, 5 or less mana, and Ral's pushing the border of expensive, but 5 is fine for this. Anytime a planeswalker pluses and draws you a card, I think that already makes for a card that you should be interested in, especially when the second card goes to the graveyard in a deck that cares about sending cards to the graveyard. The dream, of course, is to draw like a removal spell and then throw a jumpstart card in the graveyard or something like that. It also fuels the -3, which is Bacon Bolt. It says Ral deals damage to target creature equal to the total number of instant or sorceries you own in exile and in your graveyard. It's literally Bacon Bolt, right? Sizzly. You get to just destroy a creature if you have enough instants or sorceries. It might be similar to Bacon Bolt, where you have an issue with how many instants or sorceries, so this might not be reliable removal for bigger creatures, but by the time you get to 5 mana, hopefully you've got at least like 2 spells in your graveyard, then this could be -3, deal 2 damage to a creature. That seems fine to me, right? If you get to ever just play this, kill a creature, and then it dies on the next turn, well, it was a 5 mana removal spell, and your opponent had to spend some resources attacking it rather than you, so you gained a little bit of life, I think that's fine. The -8 doesn't really matter since it's just, oh, I won the game, but we'll read it anyway. It says you get an emblem with, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, this emblem deals 4 damage to any target and you draw 2 cards. Like, whatever, right? You win the game if you -8. You cast like 2 instants of sorceries, your opponent takes 8, you draw 4 more cards, you go off, you just completely destroy them, right? And the fact that this is plussing to get you to that point is pretty nice, right? You're drawing extra cards. You get to plus the moment you play Ralzeric if it's protective, maybe on a closer to empty board. And it goes up to 6 loyalty, which is a lot. So I think Ralzeric is a bomb. It's a card you're very happy to first pick. It's splashable in a lot of other decks, like even in Izzet, or rather Boros, not Izzet. Even in Boros, I would consider just, trying to play Izzet Guild Gates and putting Ralzeric in there as some sort of like finisher or card advantage engine, which Boros might not otherwise have access to. It's going to be fantastic in the archetype. I think this is going to be one of the cards that you're really hoping you get during your pre-releases or your drafts. The other one, admittedly worse than Ralzeric, I think. Well, maybe not. Its power level might be higher, but that mana cost, though, look at it. Niv Mizzet Perun is blue, 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 red, red, red. So uncastable dot card is what we're looking at here. It's a 5/5. It's a rare legendary dragon wizard, like all Niv Mizzets are. It says it can't be countered. Okay, fine upside. There's only like 3 counter spells in this set, but it's fine to have that text tacked on for mirror matches. It has flying, obviously. And it says whenever you draw a card, it deals 1 damage to any target. Already a nice ability, but this last part really pushes it over the edge. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, you draw a card. Whenever a player, that includes you, well, you just get to chain all of your instants or sorceries into more card draw. That seems absurd to me. If you can get Niv Mizzet on board, and maybe you can't even cast it on turn 6, you play it on turn 7 or something like that, turn 8, this card's still going to be a beat-in, right? And if your opponent has an answer to it, that kind of sucks, right? If they try to destroy it with, kill target creature, then you have to accept that, but at the very least, its last ability will trigger and replace itself. So it's really hard to kill Niv Mizzet and not net the opponent at least 1 card or at least replace itself. You would have to have a creature that kills it somehow, and there's not a lot that does that. If you're playing Izzet, you should be able to cast this card fairly easily, right? The mana cost looks super restrictive, and it is, and you have to accept the fact that sometimes you won't be able to cast it on turn 6. You have to have all colored mana. You can't really play off-color sources. You can't do too much splash and stuff like that, right? You have to be really committed to Izzet if you want to play this card, but it makes for a fine first pick, and then you can push Izzet afterwards, right? I like Niv Mizzet a little bit less than Ralzeric due to its mana cost, but I think it's going to be a great card. And that does it for Izzet. So that leaves us with one final guild, Selesnya, with Convoke. And Selesnya looks pretty exciting too. And then after that, we'll be doing a 2-parter of all of the rest of the cards that haven't been covered in one of the guild videos. So I thank you for spending your time watching this video. I hope it's informative. I hope if you're still watching these for some reason, that they have been of some use to you. And I hope if you like Izzet, then you will get something out of this video, right? Stay tuned next time for Selesnya. My name's Timothy with Mana Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I will see you there.